Thank you, James. I appreciate that introduction and appreciate all of you coming out to talk about the prophets and social justice. I'm honored to be included in this lecture series. I look at some of the other names of the people who have presented, and I'm very honored to be asked. Appreciate Kim issuing me that invitation. I have heard lectures where the speaker began with self-effacing comments. They usually sound embarrassing and insincere. But as I worked on this lecture, I could not help but think of Bill McElwain and the courageous prophetic life that he led. So even if I am not self-effacing, I feel humble comparing my ministry to his. I wonder about my street cred to make this presentation. How much of a prophetic life, prophetic ministry have I lived? I wonder about that. As I look back on what I might consider my credentials to do this, I realize that many of them might be considered derivative. I once taught a course that Zan Holmes was supposed to teach. I ended up teaching, so I substituted, I pinch-hitted for Zan Holmes. And then on one other occasion, and I'm not making this up, I really did this, I preached in place of Cecil Williams. Now, if that surprises you, you should have seen the looks on the faces of the people who came in late and didn't hear the explanation for why I was preaching and not Dr. Williams. They're looking at them, looking up at me, looking at them, looking up at me, trying to figure out what I was doing sitting at their preaching instead of Cecil Williams. I want to start with a song that I am not going to sing. We can consider this our anthem. the song, but I'm going to stop it. Whether this song fits your musical taste or not, you may have appreciated the sense of optimism in the chorus. We can change the world, rearrange the world, and then the line, it's starting to get better. The song Chicago was written by Graham Nash in response to the riots during the 1968 Democratic National Convention and the subsequent trial of the Chicago 8. Nash pleaded in the song for Stephen Stills and Neil Young to come to Chicago to put on a benefit concert to pay legal fees for the Chicago 8. The song expresses the optimism of the late 60s. In the late 60s, all these movements seemed to be coming together. People thought things were really going to change. If there was an anthem for that time, it might be Bob Dylan's song, "The Times They Are Changing." Many people believed something new really was coming. Starting to get better. This is a quote from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. These words may have an unexpectedly optimistic ring at a time when pessimism is the prevailing mood. People are often surprised to learn that I am an optimist. They know how often I've been jailed, how frequently the days and nights have been filled with frustration and sorrow, how bitter and dangerous are my adversaries. They expect these experiences to harden me into a grim and desperate man. They fail, however, to perceive the sense of affirmation generated by the challenge to embrace the struggle and surmounting obstacles. So Dr. King affirming his optimism in the 60s. This sense of optimism fits with one strand of the prophetic writing. This early strand of prophetic thinking from the 8th century expected that things could change. That the people of Israel genuinely could effect justice. This is from Isaiah 11. A shoot will grow up from the stump of Jesse. A branch will sprout from his roots. The Lord's Spirit will rest upon him, a spirit of wisdom and understanding, a spirit of planning and strength, a spirit of knowledge, fear of the Lord. He will delight in fearing the Lord. He won't judge by appearances, nor decide by hearsay. He will judge the needy with righteousness, and decide with equity for those who suffer in the land. He will strike the violent with the rod of his mouth, and the breath of his lips will kill the wicked. Righteousness will be the belt around his hips, and faithfulness the belt around his waist. The wolf will live with the lamb, and the leopard will lie down with the young goat. The calf and the young lion will feed together, and a little child will lead. The cow and the bear will graze. Their young will lie down together, and a lion will eat straw like an ox. A nursing child will play with the snake's hole. Toddlers will reach right over the serpent's den. They won't harm or destroy anywhere on my holy mountain. The earth will surely be filled with the knowledge of the Lord, just as the water covers the sea. Scholars debate whether this passage formed part of the coronation ceremony for Hezekiah. Whatever some people might tell you, however, this passage does not predict the birth of Jesus. We read it during Advent, and the patristic period look back at texts like these to help understand who Jesus was. Originally, though, this oracle expressed the optimism that a leader could arise on whom the Spirit of the Lord rested, and that this leader could bring about justice. Verse 4 speaks especially to our concerns. He will judge the needy with righteousness. and decide with equity for those who suffer in the land. He will strike the violent with the rod of his mouth, with the breath of his lips, and kill the wicked. A sense that a king, wise, pursuing justice and righteousness, could bring about justice and righteousness. A key to this passage is to recognize that it speaks to this creation. This is going to happen in this world as we know it. A wise king will be able to bring about justice in this world as we know it. From the lineage of David, it have wide-ranging effects. This is not about an afterlife. This is about life in this world. The ruler can do it. A wise ruler with the Spirit of the Lord can do it. Now, the passage presents some ideas that we would find unrealistic, to say the least. Vegan wolves, predators lying down with animals that used to be their prey. All of nature is transformed. This is not something that we would expect in this life, in this creation. As we'll see, a later passage in Isaiah picks up on this. This sense that the people could achieve justice, that justice was possible, permeated the writings of the prophets of the 8th century BC, Isaiah, Amos, and Micah. Scholars believe that the original Micah, the historical Micah, probably came simply to pronounce judgment. God is done with you, God is going to punish you, and here's why. The why had to do with their lack of justice, because they perverted justice. The 8th century prophets who condemned injustice were looking at, among other things, economic stratification, confiscation of land, and an unfair court system. The prophets preached that the land was God's gift to all of the community. This was God's gift. God gave you this land. But the rich were finding ways to confiscate the land of people who couldn't pay their debts. And so the rich were accumulating more and more land. It led to economic stratification and an unfair court system that allowed the rich, legally, to take the land from the poor and people who had fallen into debt. This is one of the practices that the prophets condemned. They wanted to convince the people, this is the land that God gave you. Now perhaps everyone in the room knows at least a little of the words of the 8th century prophets when they speak about justice. If nothing else, this organization, Dallas Area Christian Progressive Alliance, uses a phrase from Amos on its website. Let justice roll down like waters, righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. That is such a powerful image that we can take a minute to explore it. Rolling down like waters means that justice happens suddenly, instantly, like a sudden rainstorm. Justice happens now, quickly, swiftly. It speaks to the chant, we want justice and we want it now. Righteousness like a sudden shower. The ever-flowing stream speaks to the idea of a constant supply. It's always there. Let justice roll down like waters, suddenly, quickly, swiftly, but an ever-flowing stream, so that you have a constant supply. The terms justice and righteousness are parallel terms. Justice refers to basic fairness, basic equity, that people have access to goods and services, that the court system is fair, that people are treated fairly. Righteousness speaks more to relationships between people and within. Do you have a righteous relationship within yourself and to your neighbor and to God? Righteous people will bring about justice. So justice and righteousness. Do we recognize our connection to other people? Do we have fair business practices? This is justice and righteousness. James Mays, one of my professors at Union Seminary, the author and editor of several works of the prophets, states unequivocally that the prophets believed the people could do it. If they understood the message, if they understood their identity, if they understood what God had done for them, and how God interacted with them, and what God expected from them, they could do it. They could achieve justice. The question is how? How do you motivate people to pursue justice? What do you say? What words do you use? We will look at Amos as a representative of the rhetorical strategies that the prophets used to persuade the people. Amos reminded the people, the leaders, the people, of the consequences of a lack of justice. What happens when you don't have justice? I have sent a famine in all your cities, and not provided enough bread in all your places. Yet you didn't return to me, says the Lord. So they've suffered the consequences for their actions. Famine. They're hungry. The consequences of not pursuing justice are concrete, right in front of them. Amos issued threats. The Lord proclaims, for 3 crimes of Israel, and for 4 I won't hold back the punishment. Because they have sold the innocent for silver, and those in need for a pair of sandals. They crushed the heads of the poor into the dust of the earth, and pushed the afflicted out of the way. Father and son have intercourse with the same young woman, degrading my holy name. So a threat. God will punish you for what you've done. Amos appealed to gratitude. I brought you up out of the land of Egypt and led you 40 years in the wilderness. I raised up some of your children to be prophets and some of your youth to be Nazarites. Isn't this so, people of Israel? Yeshua, look what I have done for you. I have been your God. I formed you as a community. I led you out of slavery. You should respond in gratitude to what I have done. Amos tried bitter sarcasm. Hear this word, you cows of Bashan? He was speaking at the United Methodist Women's Group at First Church Bashan. Hear this, you cows of Bashan? Who are on Mount Samaria, who cheat the weak, who crush the needy, who say to their husbands, bring drinks so that we can drink. The Lord God has solemnly promised by his holiness, the days are surely coming, when they will take you away with hooks, even the last of you with fishhooks. You will go to the broken wall, each of you, one after another, and you will be flung out into harmony, says the Lord. So a number of rhetorical strategies to get the people's attention. Reminding them of the consequences. Issuing threats. Appealing to gratitude. Bitter sarcasm. Those are among the rhetorical strategies that the prophets used. We progressives like to quote the prophets. We feel kinship with them. We consider them our heroes. One thing we rarely hear about the prophets. People lecture to us or preach to us about the prophets. It didn't work. It didn't work. For all of their eloquence, for all of their poetic language, for all of their vivid images, the people didn't listen. For his efforts, Amos got chased off by Amaziah, the head priest. For his efforts, Jeremiah was thrown into a pit. Amos, Isaiah, Micah couldn't prevent the Assyrian conquest of the northern kingdom of Samaria or Israel. Ezekiel couldn't prevent the Babylonian conquest of the southern kingdom of Judah. vivid images, the prophets could not change the hearts of the people. They had passionately thought God's people would listen. Amos preached in the northern kingdom of Samaria. Once the Assyrians destroyed that kingdom, it never returned as a political entity. Only in the southern kingdom of Judah did hope remain alive. The most beautiful, eloquent poetry of the Bible comes in what scholars call 2nd Isaiah. 2nd Isaiah likely was one who had studied prior to 1st Isaiah, the 8th century prophet, the historical original Isaiah. He wrote, 2nd Isaiah wrote to the returning exiles, the ones who had been in exile and now had the opportunity to return to Jerusalem. He persuaded them to return to Jerusalem. He told them that their return was God's work. This is what God is doing among them. We recognize the words of 2nd Isaiah. We hear them every Advent. Comfort, comfort my people, says your God. We recognize the ways Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. quoted 2nd Isaiah. I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted. Every hill and mountain shall be made low. Rough places shall be made plain. Crooked places shall be made straight. The glory of the Lord will be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. Those are the words of 2nd Isaiah, quoted by Martin Luther King Jr. in the I Have a Dream speech. 2nd Isaiah spoke to the defeated exiles, discouraged, assuming God had abandoned them, encouraged them to go back to Jerusalem. God had forgiven their sins. God would do a new thing among them. 2nd Isaiah seems to have assumed that the people, having experienced exile, would feel chastened. After 50 years in exile, they would feel chastened. Now they understood God's judgment. Now they didn't take God's wrath seriously. Now they would form a real community. In Isaiah 54, the prophet has an interesting image for God and the relationship with the people. God is the wayward husband who's dumped his wife, Israel, gone off, and now he's come back. Now come back. Image of love and tenderness, and a strange image for God. But the assumption was that the relationship could pick up, and that the people, having experienced exile, having been carted away, having experienced defeat, now they would understand. Now they would get it. Now they would form a community. When we read the majestic words of 2nd Isaiah, feel their stirring force, their wonderful images, metaphors, one thing we have to remember. It didn't work. 2nd Isaiah inspired the people to go back to Jerusalem, go back to their home, begin rebuilding. But they didn't form a just community. They didn't reconcile. They didn't see themselves as one people. The returning exiles came back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple, to restart their mission, only to encounter the ones who had stayed behind, the ones the Babylonians had left there. Two groups clashed. If we think hard, we might come up with an example of people coming from another country and feeling unwelcome in the country in which they're going. That's what happened to the returning exiles. They were not welcomed back by the people who had stayed behind. The returning exiles faced one problem after another. group considered itself the real people of God. There was constant conflict between the returnees and the ones who stayed behind. We can see the depth of their frustration in Isaiah 64. The prophet speaks directly to God out of frustration for all the problems that the community is having. If only you would tear open the heavens and come down. God would tear open heaven, come down and fix all of these problems in the community. That was the plea of the prophet. So, the harsh, condemning words of Amos didn't work. The chewing out from Micah didn't work. Micah accused the people of practicing cannibalism, chewing up their poor and spitting them out. Didn't work. Ezekiel's wonderful image of the bones coming back to life, flesh coming back on the bones, didn't work. Second, Isaiah's promise that when you go back to Jerusalem, trees of the field will clap their hands, applauding you as you go. Didn't work. What do you do when the words of the prophets don't work? When the people won't listen? When things don't change? What do you do? One answer within the Old Testament was apocalyptic theology. We're familiar with the Apocalypse, book of Revelation. Apocalyptic theology pushed hope into a time of resurrection. You're not going to see God's justice in this world. You're not going to see it here. You're going to see it in a resurrection. In the book of Daniel, the other kingdoms, Babylon, Persia, Greece, these are horrendous, awful-looking beasts rising from the sea. The only place you're going to see real justice, you can see God's intervention, is when God actually destroys these kingdoms. You live a life in resurrection. Those who sleep in the dust will arise. You find hope only in resurrection. It's a way of showing a lack of faith or hope for this creation. Only in the resurrection. So the question for apocalyptic theology, it pushes justice and peace and righteousness off to a time of resurrection is, what does it do for this world? Where does it lead this creation? So that's why I want to focus on Isaiah 65. You have a handout on Isaiah 65. That's one of your two handouts. I didn't know how many people would be here tonight, or who would be here who had theological training, who had all of that kind of stuff. So there's one sheet that's the very briefest of introductions to the prophets. It talks a little bit about who the prophets were and what they tried to say, oracles of condemnation and oracles of hope. Gives you a little bit of background on the composite nature of the prophets. That the book of Isaiah was probably written over centuries. And by 3 or maybe 4 authors or more and editors. So a very brief introduction to the prophets. All right, so the prophets, in their harsh words, their words of hope, didn't convince the people to pursue justice, didn't persuade them. Apocalyptic theology pushes hope off into a resurrection. What we have in Isaiah 65 is what scholars call proto-apocalyptic. P-R-O-T-O, proto-apocalyptic. We know a prototype is an early version of something. So this is proto-apocalyptic. It's not quite apocalyptic, but it's different from what the prophets assume. The prophets assume if we preach it right, if we say it right, the people will listen and they'll respond. Understand their identity and they'll respond. Proto-apocalyptic is a transition between the two. The reason I want to hold on, where I want to focus on Isaiah 65, is it holds on to the prophetic call for justice, and it sees it as God's word, the way apocalyptic does, but it doesn't give up on this creation. So, Isaiah 65, starting in verse 17. Look! I am creating a new heaven and a new earth. Past events won't be remembered. They won't come to mind. Be glad and rejoice forever in what I'm creating, because I'm creating Jerusalem as a joy, and her people as a source of gladness. I will rejoice in Jerusalem and be glad about my people. No one will ever hear the sound of weeping and crying in it again. No more will babies live only a few days, or the old fail to live out their days. The one who dies at 100 will be like a young person, and the one falling short of 100 will see a curse. They will build houses and live in them. They won't plant vineyards and eat their fruit. They won't build for others to live in, or plant for others to eat. Like the days of the tree will be the days of my people, my chosen, will make full use of their hand. They won't labor in vain, nor bear children for world of harvest, because they will be people blessed by the Lord. They along with their descendants. Before they call, I will answer. While they are still speaking, I will hear. Wolf and lamb will graze together, and the lion will make straw like the ox. But the snake, its food will be dust. They will mark earth or destroy in any place on my holy mountain, says the Lord. So, in proto-apocalyptic theology, God does not sweep away this creation to bring in a new place where you go in resurrection. God renews and restores this creation. It's still a voice of hope for this world, this creation. If we look at the elements of Isaiah 65, look, I'm creating a new heaven and a new earth. The word there for creating is a word that's always associated with God. It's what God can do. It's what God can accomplish. It's the same word that's used in Genesis 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So this is something God is going to do, to restore, renew, refurbish this creation. It's going to be so good that you forget all the bad things in the past. Now, verse 18. I am creating Jerusalem as a joy. Typically, when I preach on this passage in my churches, I'll tell them I'm translating from Hebrew to American. And I make them promise not to snicker. I'm creating Washington, D.C. as a joy. See how weird it sounds? Creating Washington, D.C. as a joy. A place of bickering, of backbiting, of accusations, of gotcha, bitter tension. Creating it as a joy. That's how they experienced Jerusalem. Bitter conflict. Creating it as a joy. All of the infighting, all the conflict, all the craziness, God transforms into joy. So God will transform the political realm. We're going to skip a few verses and come back. They will build houses and live in them. They will plant vineyards and eat their fruit. So labor will not be oppressive. As it is now, of course, laborers are exploited. I have done some work with your breeder, job for justice. Undocumented workers sometimes work all day and no one pays them. They can't complain because they don't have the documentation to be here in this country. So they do a whole day's work, don't get paid. Minimum wage is not little. People work but can't enjoy the fruits of their labor. So they will build houses and live in them. They will plant vineyards and eat their fruit. I saw an article not long ago about cocoa farmers. For the first time in their lives, eating chocolate. Almost a word-for-word fulfillment of this verse. They get to enjoy the fruits of their labors. Labor Day was just a few weeks ago, but we rejoice in such occasion. God will transform labor so that it is not oppressive, so that it is fulfilling. People will see the fruits of their work. Okay? Now we jump back to verse 20. No one will babies live only a few days, and the old fail to live out their days. Now that gets us into the realm of healthcare. But it also gets us out of reality. An infant mortality rate of 0 would be wonderful. It's not something we can achieve. But it promises us that's God's vision, where every life has fulfillment. Somebody dies at 100, and everybody says, what a shame. Life got so short. Birth and life will be fulfilled. So, we have a vision for politics, a vision for labor, a vision for health care. All of that touched on in Isaiah 65. These are the concerns of social justice. Now, Isaiah 65 would say is total apocalyptic. This is not something we can work hard to achieve. This is what only God can do. God says, I am creating a new heaven and a new earth. But God doesn't push this. Isaiah 65 doesn't push this off to a time of resurrection. This is still an affirmation of this life, this creation. It's not like the creation we have. We still have the vegan wolves and the vegan lions. Not something we can achieve, but God's vision, where nature is redeemed of its law of tooth and claw, or the blood-red law of nature is. So, we have Isaiah's prophecy, Isaiah's book, politics, labor, healthcare, and now ecology. The wolf, the lamb lying down together, vegan lions. So, the concerns of social justice, you can tick them off in this, you can run down the list in this passage of social justice. Again, only God can do this, but it's still tied to this creation. At the very end, Isaiah addresses our relationship to God. Verse 24. For they call, I will answer. While they are still speaking, I will hear. Now, this wonderful vision touches on many topics. The concerns of social justice, politics, labor, healthcare, ecology, connection to nature. Something only God can do. Now, if we want to look at this, though, and see where can we fit in, where can we plug in, what can we accomplish, it seems that the passage assumes that our vulnerability and our estrangement from God are two of the reasons we don't enact justice. We're vulnerable. We can die as babies. We can die before we hit 100. We're estranged from God. God seems distant from us. God will overcome those two barriers. We will not feel so vulnerable. We will live a long time. and we will feel close to God. Before they call, I will answer. Maybe a place for us to get to work, something we can accomplish. Helping people to see that they can turn their vulnerability over to God and working to ease the sense of estrangement, alienation that we have from God. The oracle suggests that only God can accomplish all of this. Only God can bring in His full justice. We don't have to wait for resurrection to begin pursuing justice, to begin to see victories. Only in resurrection, perhaps, will we see full justice. But this world holds out hope for this creation. However, this passage does not support naive optimism. It does not make it sound as though it will be easy. We started the lecture with a song that assumed we could change the world. Things are getting better. Forget about the politicians. We can do this ourselves. Some of this, don't ask Jack to help you. That's President Kennedy. Politicians, they're not going to do it for us. We the people can do it. Is what the song seems to assume. I would suggest that represents the naive optimism of the late 60s. The title of the lecture, We Shall Overcome, alludes to a song also associated with the 60s. We shall overcome. We don't know for sure who wrote this song, or at least my research suggests we don't know who wrote this song. But it expresses the optimism that we can succeed. We can overcome. We can do this. Now, do we hear that optimism these days? Do we hear the optimism of Graham Nash? We can change the world. Things are getting better. Just come to Chicago and sing, and we'll raise money, and we'll make a difference. Everywhere we turn now, what we hear is pessimism. This is a newspaper article written by Gerald Britt. It's talking about Brown versus Board of Education 50 years ago. Complains in the article about continued segregation. A do-nothing Congress and a more conservative Supreme Court provide little hope. I'm sorry, it's the 60th anniversary of Brown. I said 50th. It's the 60th anniversary of Brown versus Board of Education. He says, so the answers to many of our challenges today can't necessarily be found in our laws. These changes also need to take place in our hearts and in our minds. But we've seen from the prophets, it's hard to change hearts and minds. It's hard to change attitudes. We don't see this sense of optimism anymore. Leonard Pitt, the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act is certainly a time for celebration and reflection. But no one indulge in the fantasy that we are there now, and thus may cease striving for the fulfillment of America's promise. A recognition we haven't gotten. This is Charles Blow from the New York Times. He is talking about the situation in Ferguson, Missouri. He alludes to the poem Harlem, Langston Hughes. And he's talking about the frustration in the African American community. He says, but I submit that this is bigger than that. The frustration we see in Ferguson is about not only the present act of perceived injustice, but also the calcifying system of inequity, economic, educational, judicial, drawn largely along racial lines. In 1951, Langston Hughes began his poem Harlem with a question: what happens to a dream deferred? Today, I must ask, what happens when one desists from dreaming and the very exercise feels futile? So we've gone from the optimism of the late 60s we can change the world. We shall overcome. To a sense that things aren't changing. Things are staying in place. The problems we faced 50, 60 years ago are still there. The prophets would tell you, you shouldn't expect things to change easily. The writers of proto-apocalyptic and apocalyptic would say it's not going to be easy to effect social change. So our idealism has dried up. So I think we cannot take a stance of naive optimism. But I want to suggest that we not give up on this creation, waiting only for a resurrection. I believe in the resurrection. I believe that in the resurrection we will experience true justice and real peace. At least in the resurrection, God will overcome. But I don't want to give up in despair over this one. I don't want us to give up on this one. So I suggest a stance, not of naive optimism, not of despair, but of courageous resistance. Again, I know the problems of being self-effacing, so I don't want to stand up here and act as though I have achieved courageous resistance, but I suggest that we aim for that, to counter naive optimism or despair with courageous resistance. I started the lecture by playing a song by Graham Nash, Chicago. We can change the world. I will spare you playing this next song. I won't play it for you, but I'll just quote it. It's by Ozzy Osbourne. He says, I don't want to change the world. I just don't want the world to change me. In order to avoid giving up in despair, we take the stance, I'm not going to let the world change me. We can score some victories. We have made progress. Things have changed. We're not there, but we can create pockets of justice. We can try the rhetorical strategies of the prophets. We can point out to people the futility of economic stratification, that the disappearance of the middle class has consequences for the economy. That when people don't have money to buy stuff, because the rich hold all the money, but about 1% controls so much of the world's wealth, the country's wealth, it hurts the whole economy. We can try rhetorical strategies of hope. We can tell people justice is God's business. It's God's business. Most of all, we can proclaim that God sides with justice. Matthew 25 is also a defining verse for this organization, for DACA. In that passage, Matthew 25, Jesus promises us that if we work among the hungry, the thirsty, the imprisoned, the naked, we will encounter Him. I know that it's hard to motivate people when we say, well, only God can do it. It's hard to motivate them to get out and look for justice. The promise is, if we do that, if we work among the poor, we encounter Jesus. A college professor named Paul Kane was lecturing to his class about Thoreau. He asked them to read Thoreau and go back the next day to discuss it. He read their blog posts for the class, and they ridiculed Thoreau. He came in and said, Thoreau was our hero. He says, yes, but our parents grew up in the 60s, and they ended up selling out. That's what happened to the naive optimism of the 60s. RFK was shot, Martin Luther King was shot. The idealism seemed to dry up. So he began questioning it. What he discovered was he realized that yes, they had ideals, what they didn't have was hope. They wanted justice, they wanted peace, they wanted things to be better, but they didn't have hope. So the professor invited Pete Seeger to come to his class, assuming that Pete Seeger wouldn't even respond to the letter. Pete Seeger paid for his class. He talked for 3 hours to his class. One of the students said after Pete Seeger's lecture, "I have to do something now with what I know." In the end, I had to stop Pete because we were running out of time. His talk had taken a surprising turn as he was explaining his understanding of spirituality and the divine. I wasn't sure if that was the note he wished to end on, so I asked him what he wanted to leave the students with. He gave a wave of his arm and said, "God. God." So, young people today don't have the optimism that we had in the 60s and the 70s. Things can change. The times are changing. We can change the world. It's more of despair, idealism without hope. Pete Seeger would say, God. God. Quote from Alan Bosak, whose book, Dare We Speak of Hope. The language of hope begins, as it always must, with a question. Dare we even speak of hope? That question triggers other questions. Who speaks of hope? To whom do we speak of hope? How should we speak of hope? And just as important, shall we allow hope to speak for herself? Shall we allow hope to speak to us so that in listening we may learn to speak differently? When hope has taught us to speak, shall we then speak her language without fear, challenging the language of meaningless religiosity, patriotic uniformity, and political conformity? For if there is one thing that we have learned through our struggles and our faith, it is that the language of hope is first the language of suffering and pain, of truth and anger and courage, of protest and confrontation and endurance, before it is the language of comfort, uplifting, and joy. It screams before it soothes. The language of hope is a language that scorches the tongue of the powerful, the arrogant, and the violent. In the mouths of the deceitful, the comfortable, and the complacent, it grits like sand between the teeth. On the lips of the faithful, it is a balm. Speaking of hope should disturb us before it comforts us. So, the prophets preached about justice. They preached as eloquently as anybody could preach. Their words didn't get through. We don't give up hope. I hope that I have not opened myself up to the criticism that I'm a comfortable white male and don't want things to change. That's why I say we have to wait for God to get full justice. I hope you don't critique me as being too negative. But as I read the prophets themselves, and as I read the world around me, I don't see a basis for naive optimism. I don't know that we can change the world. I know that such talk does make it harder to recruit, to motivate people to seek justice. We have a small crowd. I know that there are many reasons for that. I've called for a stance between naive optimism and despair, a stance of courageous resistance. That's our motivation, in addition to Matthew, that we encounter Jesus in looking for the poor. I cite Jeremiah. He is not one of the prophets on whom we have focused tonight, but I will give him the last word. Jeremiah has the encounter with the priest Pashur. Pashur beats him up and puts him in stocks. When Jeremiah gets out of the stocks, he denounces Pashur. And he says to God, "Lord, you enticed me, and I was taken in. accuses God of cheating, of lying. You were too strong for me and you prevailed. Now I'm laughed at all the time. Everyone mocks me. Every time I open my mouth, I cry out and say, violence and destruction. The Lord's word has brought me nothing but insult and injury constantly. I thought I'll forget it. I'll no longer speak in his name. But there's an intense fire in my heart, trapped in my bones. I'm drained trying to contain it, and I'm unable to do it. As much as I like Graham Nash's music and his ideas, I do not agree that we can change the world and that things are getting better. I would say that we witness for justice, we work for justice, we celebrate the victories that we can achieve, and we commit that the world will not change us. God takes the side of justice. God's will for justice will come to pass. We will not give up in despair. We will not abandon the oppressed. We will not succumb to fatigue or pressure. We speak and act because the fire is shut up in us. We can't hold it in. We have time for time for questions or for discussion.
Of course, many of you in this room have been working in your own sacred communities to promote social justice issues. So there may be some questions from anyone where you are.
I wanted to ask about Isaiah and Jeremiah. There's a phrase in both of them about I will judge the poor and the oppressed, or judging the poor and the needy. And I wonder how you would explain your take on what that really means, because I think people...
I suppose you know where that is. I can hear them saying I judge for the oppressed.
Well, I think it's in Jeremiah, I judge the cause of the poor and the oppressed.
Okay.
And I think people may look at that and say, oh, what does that mean? I'm judging poor people. I mean, and there's a lot of that going around. So,
yes.
Do you have a response to how we might take on that particular phrase?
More so on Isaiah than Jeremiah. Isaiah championed the cause of the poor. He condemned the people for their treatment of the poor. This faithful town has become a prostitute. She was full of justice, righteousness lived in her, but now murder. Your silver has become impure, your beer is diluted with water, your princes are rebels, companions of thieves. Everyone loves a bribe and pursues gifts. They don't defend the orphan, and the widow's cause never reaches them. So, for first Isaiah, the historical Isaiah, the cause of the poor, the oppressed, the defenseless, vulnerable, was his cause. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question. You're quoting Isaiah and Jeremiah saying, I judge the poor. Is this the self-reliance that they're poor because they deserve to be poor? Is that what you're asking? That's the interpretation. Mm-hmm. Yes. Isaiah especially is much more likely to say, I judge on behalf of the poor. That was Isaiah 11. The wise ruler, the wise leader, will judge on behalf of the poor, will defend the defenseless. It's the violent, the oppressors that he slays with the breath of his lips. It's effortless. With the breath of his lips, he can slay them. He doesn't have to break a sweat to do it. It's just speaks the word, and the violent, the aggressors are taken care of. So I would say, at least, I can speak more knowledge, at least somewhat, on Isaiah, that it was their treatment of the poor that Isaiah condemned the people. Yes, sir.
I've got a brief comment and then a question for you.
Okay.
The comment is Bishop Desmond Tutu had a little bit of success bringing about social justice in South Africa.
Yes.
When I loosely paraphrase him, he in essence said, on his own, God will not. On our own, we cannot. Implying that we should partner with God in bringing about social justice. And that certainly seems to be consistent with my understanding of Micah 6:8. Do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with God. Walking humbly with God is partnering with God.
Right.
With God's wisdom. Okay, my question to you is, life's short, let's be totally frank.
Okay.
Let's be totally honest.
All right.
Seems to be, and I'm generalizing, I first admit, it seems to be that the rural areas of Texas are electing not progressive, but the other extreme, nihilistic Tea Party political leaders.
Yes.
How do you explain that? Is this due to poor theology being taught in Christian churches and rural communities? I'm just guessing. How would you explain that?
Now, I think there is a lot of poor theology being taught in rural areas, and poor theology being taught all over the country. Prosperity, yes. Yes. Prosperity theology, individualistic theology, ignoring the prophets, ignoring the call for social justice, yes. The rise of the Tea Party is hard for me to explain. I mean, and the continued support of far right wing. I think a lot of it has to do with fear. I think a lot of it has to do with just plain old selfishness. I mean, some people take plain old selfishness and dress it up as individual responsibility or traditional values or things like that. I think a lot of it has to do with antagonism towards minority groups. Yeah. Yeah, just overall. Try that. Do that. Down at the end of the talk. But I think some politicians take people who are angry and fearful and give them easy scapegoats. And I think that's why the continuing existence of far-right wing is that they're looking for scapegoats, and those politicians are only too glad to get those scapegoats. You mentioned Desmond Tutu. I have somewhere in my notes an article about how, yes, things have changed in South Africa, but then a lot of things haven't changed. So it's not the arrival of full justice. What Desmond Tutu did and Nelson Mandela with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is wonderful. Truth and Reconciliation Commission is wonderful. It's a model. But the problems of poverty are still there. So that's why I say I don't know whether the problems are intractable or not until God acts, but we should be naively optimistic that they will be easy to overcome. Yes, sir.
Is it possible that we're dealing with a situation where...
I think they want you to make the microphone.
Is it possible that we could be dealing with a situation that we move in waves, or as we saw in some of the earlier prophets, people responded and then they went back, people responded and they went back. I mean, you brought up South Africa, and on June 16, 1985, in South Africa, there in the church's written statement that was circulated, a theological rationale in the call to prayer. That theological rationale in the call to prayer statement actually caused the government to work to charge all of those pastors and those churches with treason.
Right.
Because it was a theological rationale in the call to prayer to get rid of the government and to force a change. And it was a day of prayer. And I would say that in effect, that worked, at least for a time, but not fully.
Yeah.
Right.
Worked how do you mean that it worked?
Well, there was a change.
Okay.
We did see the
Yes,
government.
we know apartheid was dismantled. Slavery, I mean, slavery was dismantled in the 19th century in the United States. So we do make progress. I think your analogy of waves, your metaphor of waves, might be instructive. I started to bring a copy of the journal Christian Century, the title of which refers to the belief that the 20th century would be the most Christian century of all time. So, again, the naive optimism. But, you have progress and then you have a backlash. And that's what happens. We make some progress and then there's a backlash. So, I don't know a way around that or a way over that. But, again, I call for a stance of courageous resistance, not naive optimism. So, we do see progress and we should work for the justice we can achieve. I'm not saying we cannot make any progress. I'm not saying we cannot do anything. I'm not saying we can't create little pockets of justice. We can't score some victories, because we can. But full justice, where there's no more poverty, no more racism, no more hatred. Yes?
Well, I think that's probably true.
Yeah, I just have the microphone up there. What you think? Okay.
I think there's one thing that really is pretty exciting, or something that we need to keep in mind. I mean, there needs to be a balance, I think, between spirituality and liberation, if you please. And I like what Karl Barth said years ago, so I didn't like everything that Karl Barth said. But I really do like something, he said something to the effect, to clasp your hands in prayer is the beginning of an uprising against the disorder of the world.
Well, he would know. He fought Nazism and the National Socialists. And, a lot of them were sent off to concentration camps. Bonhoeffer was hanged. So a lot of the prophet, the fate of a prophet, can sometimes not look like what the world would call success. But eventually, the National Socialists were defeated. So yes, we can do some things, and he would be one to speak about that, to go about resistance, courageous resistance. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, spoken as an eco-socialist, I noticed in some of the prophetic readings that there were warnings of famine, and I really do believe that there's a strong correlation between labor abuses and bigotry that in turn cause EJ, environmental justice problems, and the end result is famine. A lot of the ancient world once was the fertile crescent, but it's been a desert for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And in the Isaiah 65, there's references that we won't have infant mortality, people will live well past 100. I don't think that's health care. I think that's just plain flat health. People don't get sick in the first place. And the answer is Lord brought the serpent. The answer is frickin' us. I'm trying to hold myself.
Okay. Well,
try not to spit out some bad language, but just cotton picking at EJ.
Okay. All right. Yes. As you see in Isaiah 65, all of the pieces fit together. Labor justice, ecological justice, they all fit together. Spirituality. I'm calling your answer prayer. They weren't heard the story on Holy Mountain before they call an answer. So that speaks to prayer, spirituality, before they call an answer. They all fit together. The way you treat people, the way you treat your, it all fits together. Yes.
Any other questions? Well, I think we probably all agree this has been an insightful and inspiring presentation, encouraging all of us